A massive project connecting the world. We will take a look at 10 years of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. The infrastructure project to connect the world through land and sea, known as the Belt and Road Initiative, was launched 10 years ago in 2013. Today, about 150 countries have signed Belt and Road cooperation agreements. They account for about two-thirds of the world's population, representing a large chunk of global GDP. The Belt and Road was front and center during the recent China Central Asia Summit held in Xi'an. Earlier, I spoke with Sarwar Kashmeri. He is an international relations specialist and author. And I started by asking him about the importance of that summit.
This summit is very important, as you've pointed out. You can look at it from the trade perspective, and these countries within a few years have become the largest trading partner of China. But in my opinion, this summit between China and the 5 Central Asian countries actually is much more important in many other ways. And let me point out just one. If one takes a 10,000-foot strategic view of this summit, right, what one sees is China being able to execute diplomacy on a very wide stage. If you think about it for a moment, not long ago, China was able to negotiate a settlement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This summit itself is going on. It's a major undertaking. While this is going on, yesterday we learned that China and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is about to go through a final phase of putting together an agreement for behavior on the South China Sea. And then there is the ongoing Ukraine-Russia issue. So what this tells me anyway is that China is able to execute this wide range of diplomacy around the world and almost at the same time, which is quite remarkable. And of course, this Central Asian Summit is just a small part of that. So I wanted to point that out to your viewers, Anna.
Right, and Sarwar, as we mark this 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, what do you see as its major achievements?
Well, I think the first achievement that one has to look at is how was China able to do so much in so little time? I mean, if you think about it, in Astana 10 years ago, China announced the Belt and Road Initiative. And forgive me for saying so, but it was the West that had gone in for cultural diplomacy, working with different cultures around the world. And China went in, and a lot of people said, you know, they're going to have all kinds of problems because they're for the first time dealing with countries in Central Asia, in Africa, developed, underdeveloped countries, different religions, different cultures. But look at how successful the BRI has been. Not that it hasn't had hiccups, but by and large, it's been hugely successful. And I just think that that is a remarkable achievement, together with the changes that China has been able to make in its own people's standard of living, right? So when you look at those two, it's a very unique moment in recorded history.
China has also reshaped in many respects the relationship that big powers have with developing countries. I mean, if you look at the relationship, for instance, that China has with the continent of Africa, it's very different, let's say, from the Western relationship, investment relationship I'm talking about with these countries. If we look at the loans that these countries get from agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, China has a very different approach, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and the approach seems to be working because China doesn't feel it proper to interfere in the internal workings of these countries, Hana. right? Basically, China says, listen, you have your country to run, we have our country to run. Let's take our proven technologies and our systems of interconnecting roads, bridges, and work on that so that you can take advantage of the way China has raised the standard of living of its own people. Right? Let's not forget that over the last 30 years, China has raised what? Roughly 800 million people above the poverty level. And that's what China wants to implant to these other countries, right? My own, if I may just say this, my own wish is that China and the West are simultaneously able to come together to remove the friction between themselves. And I think that would be the crowning achievement if we can do that.
And China's approach to development is very targeted, isn't it? If we look at its involvement, say, in Latin America, I mean, it's working on some major projects in those countries on infrastructure development, and that is something that that continent badly needs, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but also the African continent. And I suspect that that's why the BRI has been so successful on it, because connected to infrastructure is standards of living. A lot of the countries that China is working with are land constrained, right? They don't, so building roads and bridges and tunnels is hugely important to them. In Africa, countries being able to get their goods for export to the ocean. And the same thing in Central Asian countries. So you're absolutely right that it's a unique way, win-win situation, and it's really educational to see how China has learned along the way without taking a colonial attitude that many countries took 100 years ago when other countries started to industrialize and become rich.
Right, and Sarwar, we are living in a world right now that is rapidly changing. I mean, you mentioned some of those changes, but if we look at the growth of developing economies right now, and we also get the sense that there is a new assertiveness on the part of the global South diplomatically around the world. It's not what it used to be. Things are changing. There's also vigorous efforts being made right now to shift away from the dependence, the traditional dependence that the world has had on the United States dollar, for instance, as a reserve currency. How do you see these changes evolving?
Well, if I may address the dollar question first, I think that business of getting the dollar replaced is way, way, way premature. Look at the trade in the yuan, for example. The Ukraine war has increased it by 1%, right, in 2 years, which is remarkable. But I might point out that China, the use of the yuan now, percentage-wise, in global trade, is about the same as Canada, which has a vastly smaller trade relationship and economy in the world. So I think certainly there will be a leveling of the dollar compared to other currencies in one world trade. But unless I'm wrong and unless something major happens, the dollar isn't about to be replaced in the near future. Your other point, however, is extremely important from a strategic point of view. That the world is devolving into a multipolar environment. That the global South, as we refer to them now, is starting to ascend and point out that, hey, we don't want to choose between America and China. What we want to do is make sure people understand that we have a world of our own. And that's taking place simultaneously with all the other things that you have brought up in this interview. And I think that is another strategic area that we need to focus on, is the expansion of power centers away from the two that we've become accustomed to.
As far as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is one of China's signature development projects around the world, where do you see it going in the next 10 years?
You mean the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, yes.
I just see, Anand, that expanding and deepening. I think China has been very careful And I, for one, hope it stays on that track in not getting involved on the military side around the world. I think China's taken a very focused position that the best way to win hearts and minds is by raising living standards of people, getting them to advance, uh, as China has done over the last 30 or 40 years. And I sincerely hope that China keeps that focus. And if it does, I see the Belt and Road just expanding, broadening, deepening for benefit of hundreds of countries. Let's make it 200 countries or so that are in the United Nations, and I think that will just go on. So I think that China has a lot of responsibility and also a tough road ahead, not to get carried away on the military side as it becomes a larger military power.
Sarwar Kashmeri, thank you for joining us, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
To continue our discussion on the Belt and Road Initiative, let's bring in our panelists. From Beijing, Hana Ryder is the CEO of Development Reimagined and a senior associate for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Also from Beijing, Chu Chang is assistant director of the International Monetary Institute. And Ambassador Jorge Hana is a former Chilean ambassador to China and a research professor at Boston University. He joins us from Massachusetts. Welcome to all of you. Chu Chang, let me start with you. As we've just heard, the Belt and Road Initiative is the biggest foreign infrastructure project on the part of China, a huge infrastructure push that spans the globe, really. How would you assess 10 years of the BRI?
Well, in 10 years, I think the whole infrastructure building and all the whole project on the BRI is going to be bigger and deeper, just like my colleague just mentioned. For example, if you take a look right now, already China has already been signing more than thousands of bigger or smaller projects contract with all the BRI countries. We have seen already half of them has already been there. You see the road internet access, you see the ports, you see the power stations. This is going to be the great news actually for everyone. For example, if you're a businessman from Europe, if you're a businessman from Japan or Korea, if you walk among the soil of the developing nations, you see, hey, there are already highway, there are already good Wi-Fi access. So it's not only a good opportunity for the business from China, but also for every businessman from the rest of the world. And also in the future, as we have already noticed, there are going to be more of this kind of project on infrastructure going on in the Belt and Road countries. And not only by the state-owned enterprises, but also another good shining point you're going to see is many of the projects that's been signed by the private sectors or small and medium-sized enterprises from China. This is very different from other big nations doing their project overseas. Many of the Chinese small-sized and the private enterprises are doing their own part of the share in the Belt and Road Initiative. So you're going to see more of the comprehensive development happening in the Belt and Road Initiative.
So, Chu Chang, it's interesting you point that out, that this will expand to the point where there will be private sector involvement in the recipient countries.
Oh, yes. For example, if you go to Africa, you're going to see, besides the SOE of China and many of the small enterprises, probably just a pop and a mama shop, they're doing their business in Africa and also as well as other Belt and Road countries. For example, you see in Ethiopia, they have very rich resources in bamboo. In the past, people would just burn them as wood.
Right.
But when some of the Zhejiang entrepreneurs go in there, just a family shop to go in there, they find they probably can use some equipment to build some bamboo furnitures. Yeah. And so they do it. They hired like 10 people, and then they have been building very good furniture out of the bamboo, making good benefit, and hired the local hands and creating lots of income for local families. Lots of stories like this are happening every day.
Hana Ryder, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Talking about Africa, China is, of course, Africa's largest bilateral trading partner. Many of the infrastructure, in fact, most of the infrastructure projects we see in Africa right now is financed by China. You've been doing a lot of work on this. How do you see the past 10 years of BRI?
Well, I think like the others, I would say that it has been very successful, although of course for the last few years because of COVID-19, there has been a slowing down of projects, but hopefully that will be increasing again. But I think one thing that others have not yet mentioned is that there are 52 African countries that have actually signed MOUs on the Belt and Road Initiative. And so the sort of pace of interest in Belt and Road Initiative has increased over time. We had initially East African countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, and then eventually West African countries and others really starting to show interest in the Belt and Road Initiative, and especially the infrastructure aspects of it. And this is what has been most attractive to African countries, because it has been very, very difficult, as your previous commentator was mentioning, it has been very difficult to extract infrastructure financing, especially infrastructure financing which should effectively go across the continent, so between different countries, not just one country, and also for example, in the railway infrastructure. This is just something that the international financial institutions do not necessarily provide finance for enough. And so African countries have found it very useful to have a development partner that is willing to finance these kinds of connectivity projects. And the aspiration, whether it's Tanzania's president, whether it's the Eritrean president coming over to Beijing, they have all expressed continued interest in the Belt and Road Initiative going forwards.
Right, and Hana, how has the financial model changed? Because before BRI, of course, many of the African countries depended on institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund for finance. But now they are getting loans from China. It's a very different model, isn't it?
Well, to some degree, yes. But they are still looking for finance from the World Bank and IMF. There's no kind of, to be honest, there's too many challenges to be able to say, okay, we're only going to look at China. They're still looking at the different banks, and the African Development Bank in particular has also been very helpful on infrastructure, and in fact has been one of the co-financers of several infrastructure projects with China as well. But it is a different model. There are, especially for countries who, for example, have not even been able to access loans from the private sector, China has been a very important partner, because countries often have to get loans at higher interest rates and so on. So with China, they've been able to get loans which are both not only lower interest, but they are also large enough that they can really invest in transformational infrastructure and transformational development. And that's what they're really looking for, rather than investing in kind of recurrent expenditure. They're really putting this into sustainable activities.
Ambassador Hana, of course, there are several Latin American countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think at last count there was something like 7, but there are also other countries in Latin America which have extensive trade and economic and diplomatic links with China. I'm thinking of a country like Brazil, for instance. How has the Belt and Road Initiative over the past 10 years reshaped what is happening in Latin America?
Well, there are 22 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a very significant, out of 33, it's a very significant number of countries. And yes, well, one of the most exciting things I've been able to watch, I arrived in Beijing to my post as ambassador of Chile in July of 2014, when BRI was just getting started. And so I've been able to observe how it has evolved into this extraordinary development program for the Global South. The initial version of BRI was to recreate Eurasia, very ambitious, trying to connect the fastest growing region in the world, East Asia, with the biggest market, the European Union. But over time, it has morphed into something else, into something much broader, including, for example, the Western Hemisphere, including Latin America. And that, it seems to me, is very significant. Why? Because BRI involves much more than just, building bridges and power stations and ports. It represents a different conception of what development is all about. Basically, many economists in my part of the world, at least, had given up on the very word development. They talk about macroeconomic equilibria, about the right business climate. And if on the assumption that if that is created, everything else will flow. Well, it doesn't necessarily go that way. And what China has done is to say, well, you need infrastructure, you need connectivity, something that had basically disappeared from the program of the Bretton Woods institutions. And that has come in, very handily for Latin America and for the rest of, the global South. And that, it seems to me, is extremely important. The second point I would like to underscore is the following. Often what is forgotten is that there's also a significant amount of agency on the part of the partner countries. Latin America, for example, as I said earlier, was not originally contemplated in BRI, but it ended up being associated with it, among other things, because the interest expressed by Latin American countries. And I participated in the first BRI International Cooperation Forum held in Beijing in May of 2017, in which two Latin American presidents, my own president, Michelle Bachelet, and the Argentine president, Mauricio Macri, participated. So I would like to say that BRI has been extremely significant for the Global South, and is making a tremendous difference in Latin America as well.
Hana, one criticism that's been leveled at by Western countries at the BRI is that it places recipient countries in something of a debt trap. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, first of all, the criticism comes from a place of thinking that countries do not need, that countries are not having enough agency themselves. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who are going to China and actually would like, and other partners, to ask for infrastructure finance and so on. And many countries themselves are also themselves, they're putting their own money into infrastructure. Yeah. So this is not, it is a very odd argument. In addition, I think the way that this is framed is as if countries do not need these projects going forward, but actually they do. Many of the projects that that Chinese finances have been able to support have been projects which have been waiting to be supported for a very, very long time. African leaders have been looking for the right development partners to work with them and to listen to them about how their own visions for development. And so I think the idea of this sort of criticism is really just does not take into account that perspective, that these are projects that need to happen. These are projects that will ultimately help to improve and lift, help people get themselves out of poverty, full stop.
Chu Chang, so much of the criticism that we see, especially from Western countries, has become embroiled, of course, in the geopolitical rivalry that we see now. And we have seen a lot of criticism of BRI recently. But this is how a former United Nations Under-Secretary General, Erik Solheim, this is how he explains the criticism. Let's listen.
There is a number of criticisms in the West to Belt and Road, but I have to be frank, this is mainly due to jealousy. Because there have been a number of Western initiatives which should kind of match Belt and Road. So far, very little have come out of it.
So we heard from Sarwar Kashmeri, our guest at the beginning of the show, talking about this as well, Chu Chang. But would it be fair to say a lot of this criticism is politically driven and is largely a failure on the part of Western countries to recognize that the world is changing, that we're now living in a multipolar world?
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with that. I'm not saying this is jealous, because this is really some hard work. If I ask you to do some, building works of the bridges and the roads, probably you wouldn't be jealous of that. But indeed, I can explain it as a new model for development. In the past, everybody believed there are only like two sides to choose in the whole world. It's kind of the Cold War type of thinking. But right now, China actually showed the rest of the world that we have a third road to pick. Yes, that is to, I would like to stay alone and to do my business with my trading partners, build a good life for myself and with my, international communities, with friends. This is a kind of the third road, with only development business and the living standard with no political string attached. This can work, and most of the world, developing nations, emerging markets would like to choose this road because they would nothing but a good life for themselves, for their families and countries. So China actually showed the world this is working, and more of the country would like to join this consensus, join China, to build a better world. And by doing this, I think China is infusing a good prosperity and stability to the rest of the world. And this is, I think, what the world is really needing right now, facing geopolitical conflicts, facing the potential recessions of the economy. So I think this is a good choice.
Ambassador Hana, we were talking earlier on about the possible expansion of BRI to involve the private sector in recipient countries. But if we look at the BRI's involvement so far, it's been focused largely on infrastructure development. Do you see this initiative perhaps being expanded to involve other development sectors?
Well, it seems to me there are two key things here. One of them is infrastructure, the other is connectivity. And those two things are extremely important. And for Latin America, who has had a very low investment in infrastructure, 2.5% of GDP. In East Asia, it's 8%. This is very important. And you look at countries like Panama, for example, which have had a number of very significant projects with the involvement of Chinese companies. And some of them are now being reactivated. You can see the difference they can make. Now, on the question of the private sector, I think it's important to look for ways in which partnerships can be developed between perhaps funds leveraged by Chinese banks and then relying also with the private sector. The key thing here is to move, it seems to me, on infrastructure and connectivity and thus catalyze the development that Latin America needs.
Hana, we were talking about the relationship that China has with the countries of Africa, especially when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, in 2018, there was the China-Africa Forum. What did that do for relationships?
Well, the relationship between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation has been quite significant. There's significant overlap. And in fact, to be honest, when the Belt and Road Initiative, I was also in China initially at that time when the Belt and Road Initiative was being announced, and there was significant confusion between the two of them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what has been clear is that they're complementary and that many African countries see them as complementary. And I think the big question is going to be, how can the Belt and Road continue this emphasis on infrastructure? Ideally, there is a commitment to infrastructure financing from China on the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And I think many African countries want to make sure that that continues into the future.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.